I know the DCEU was a very inconsistent mess, and I'm very ready to move on from it. I'm actually really excited to see what James Gunn is going to do with his universe, but I feel like we need to give the Shazam movies more credit. Out of the many movies in the DCEU, the Zachary Levi Shazam movies are actually some of my favorites out of that whole universe. So let's just jump straight into things and look back at the Shazam movies. And if you like watching me yap about comic book movies or TV shows, then you should definitely subscribe so you can see more content just like it. So the first Shazam movie follows Billy Batson, a child in the foster care system who is very torn about the loss of his mother. He wants to find her. He doesn't think that he has been abandoned, but he also has to accept the fact that he is in a new foster family after running away from his previous homes. Once he gains the powers of Shazam, he needs to learn not only what it means to be a hero, but what it means to have a family. And I think the main reason I really love the first Shazam movie so much is because of its story being so heartfelt, but also just being a fun and dumb time with this character. I think the movie really executes its found family storyline very well, and I also really love how it knows when to balance jokes and action scenes along with that story. Speaking of the humor in the first Shazam movie, I actually find the movie to be pretty funny at times. I don't think every joke lands though. There are some dated jokes in here, but there are exceptions where you get peak comedy like this.
It was crazy, man. Creatures from hell. Lightning coming out of everyone's.
Another thing I love about the first movie is that it takes place during Christmas, and I am a huge Christmas guy, and I feel like they take advantage of the winter setting for the most part. Another thing I really like about these movies is Zachary Levi is really good at portraying a kid who is pretending to be an adult. Like, you kind of get the impression that Billy is trying his hardest to act like an adult every time he is in his Shazam form, and it really works. Another thing that really works for the first movie is the introduction of Freddie Freeman, the best character in both of these movies, not even a question, but also the other members in the foster family that Billy is staying with. I think they're all, for the most part, charming, but I feel that they're not nearly as developed as someone like Freddie, because the movie does really focus on the relationship between Billy and Freddie, trying to build that brotherly bond and having Freddie kind of be his guide to being a superhero, and it leads to a lot of great character progression for Billy, because Billy decides to just really dick around with his powers and not really take them seriously, which leads to Freddie trying to snap Billy out of his stupidity and telling him that he needs to be an actual hero and use his powers for good, because Freddie is a massive fan of characters like Batman and Superman, which do exist in this world because, well, it's the DC universe. I will say though, for as much as I love this movie, I think the one big downside to it is the fact that Professor Savannah is a very forgettable villain, and he doesn't really do a whole lot to stand out. And what I mean is that he's supposed to mirror Billy in the sense that he never had a loving family, so he is just completely emotionally numb, where Billy is so focused on finding his biological mother that he is ignoring the foster family that wants to love and take care of him. But it just doesn't really work for me because Professor Savannah doesn't really have a whole lot of screen time, and he doesn't really do a whole lot. So the whole mirror villain thing doesn't really work that well in my opinion. Speaking of Billy's mother, that's another thing that I think the movie does a really good job of when it comes to its found family storyline. And there's a very good scene in the movie where Billy finally meets his mother, and he's basically trying to become a family with her again, and he's basically saying like, hey, I know that you lost me, but I finally found you. It's then revealed that she didn't actually lose him and that she left them there on purpose because she was only a teenager at the time when she was a mother, and she couldn't handle it and she wanted to do different things in life, so she figured that he would have found a better family in the foster care system. And this is where Billy realizes that maybe he was wrong and the family that he's been spending so much time neglecting actually does love him. And Billy realizes that she isn't going to be the mother that he always wanted or dreamed of, so he decides to go back to the family that does want him around, and he wants to really love them and give them a chance, and also to protect them. One more thing I forgot to mention about Dr. Savannah is that he does have the powers of the 7 deadly sins, and while I do think that Dr. Savannah is forgettable, I actually really love the designs of the 7 deadly sins. They just look really fucking cool in my opinion. Overall, those are my opinions on the first movie. I think it's very good and it deserves more love than it gets. But now it's time to talk about Shazam: Fury of the Gods. The second movie decides to introduce the Sisters of Afen as the main antagonist of the movie. Now Billy and his family must team up together to fight against the Sisters of Afen and protect Earth from their wrath. This movie also decides to tackle Billy's fear of abandonment, wanting to keep the family together and stay as superheroes, but everyone seems to be going their own path and Billy doesn't really know what to do about it. I'm gonna be honest, I like Fury of the Gods for the most part, but I don't love it as much as the first movie. But let's get into the stuff that it does get right, and the stuff that just kind of brings the movie down for me. For starters, I do like the humor of this movie. It's kind of on par with the first movie, but I will admit, I think the first movie had a lot more funny moments than this one. The movie also has a similar problem to the first, where some of the jokes do feel very dated. Something I will give the sequel over the first, though, is that it has way more interesting villains than the first movie did. The Sisters of Afen are interesting characters because they give more context to Shazam's powers, and they also act as a really good mirror villain to Shazam's family. And what I mean by this is that Billy's family cooperates and works better with each other, and you can definitely tell that they do love each other, whereas the Sisters of Afen want very different things at all times, and they don't really get along that well, and they just come off as a very dysfunctional family compared to Shazam's family, which works better for a mirror villain more so than Dr. Savannah did in the first movie. Another thing that the sequel does well is that Freddie Freeman is the best character, just like in the first movie. They do a little bit more with his character in this one, explaining that he doesn't really like to team up with his family that much and prefers to be a solo vigilante with his powers, which upsets Billy a lot. And I think it's an interesting angle to take his character, considering in the first movie he really wanted to be a hero, and now he finally has his wish. He also has a romance with one of the movie's antagonists, Anthea, and I think their relationship is sweet and wholesome enough, but the movie doesn't dedicate like a lot of screen time to it, it's kind of just something on the side. Another thing I liked about the second movie was the action. While I did enjoy most of the action in the first movie, I feel like there's a lot more going on in the second movie, and the final fight scene is really awesome. Now I think it's a good time to talk about my negatives with this movie before ending the video on a positive note. I will say the pacing of the second movie is much worse than the pacing of the first movie. I feel that the movie does drag a bit during the middle and the end of the film. It definitely does go back to being engaging and fun, but there are points in this movie where I do want it to kind of just hurry up and get to the point. Another thing I'll say is that while I do think this movie is enjoyable, I don't think the sequel has as strong of a story or writing as the first movie did, and I feel like a lot of that is just because I found the first movie much more charming, where the second movie just kind of feels like a very safe sequel, if that makes sense. It also doesn't help that this movie came out around the time of the DCEU's demise. And because of the way that the movie was marketed and people just wanting something good or substantial from DC at the time, the movie at release wasn't really praised. It was more so just kind of, it's okay, but there were a lot of people who actively despised this movie. They thought it was like the worst thing ever, when in reality it was just kind of a solid sequel to a movie from 2019 that was good at the time and not much else. I overall did enjoy my time with Shazam: Fury of the Gods when it released, and I still do to this day. I think looking back on it, it was a decent enough movie, but it's definitely not what we needed at the time we were at when it came to the DCEU ending. But overall, those are my opinions on the DCEU Shazam movies. Shazam is a character that I really like, and I think these movies do a good enough job representing him. I do wish that we got to see Black Adam and Shazam fight on the big screen, but that didn't happen because of the failure that was Black Adam and The Rock having a massive ego at the time. I do really hope we can see James Gunn adapt Shazam into his new universe, even if it's without Zachary Levi. But that's all I have to say about the Shazam movies, and I'll see you guys in whatever my next project is. Thank you for watching.